You're listening to Hanging, an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose, California.
Last time on Hanging.
He called me and he said, I don't want you to tell anybody, but the kid is dead. I thought he was just a little kid who was afraid of his father.
I'm looking at a case 25 years later, and based on my reenactment, it was very clear to me that Joshua could indeed hanged himself in that barn that particular night.
You read Judge Stewart's findings of fact about the 8 acts of abuse by KW against Josh. What was your reaction when you read that?
Oh, I was just horrified. Mistakes are going to get made, and the thing is that sometimes in cases like this, the mistakes can be very consequential.
I can't stop thinking about Josh.
Welcome back to the Mercury News podcast series, Hanging, the mysterious case of the boy in the barn. I'm Julia Prodis Sulek.
Chapter 6.
The envelope arrived last December from Santa Clara County's Office of the District Attorney. Kathy Atkins was home, as she usually is. Her post-traumatic stress is still too great. The memories of her son's death are still too severe to venture out alone. Her husband, Dennis, lifted his coat from the door and pulled the letter from a pocket. He'd been waiting for the right time to give it to her, but no time, it seemed, was a good time. Here they were, in their well-kept townhouse in Philadelphia, sitting on the edge of the bed. They braced themselves. With 28 years of anticipation and dread, Kathy slipped the letter out of the envelope. She would later read it aloud for us.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Atkins, I am writing this letter to advise you of my review of the case involving the death of Joshua Sean Klaver on January 30th, 1989.
Josh's middle name, Sean, S-E-A-N, was misspelled. It was the first indignity for Kathy in the 2-page letter, signed by the DA's Stacy Capps.
I'm employed with the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office as a Chief Trial Deputy and regularly review all potential homicide cases in the county.
Kathy had been insisting for decades that the local sheriff's department had failed to take a close enough look at 10-year-old Josh's death. At the time, it had quickly been ruled a suicide, but she had pushed and pushed and pushed because she always believed Joshua's father, K.W. Klaver, a sheriff's deputy himself with a history of abusing the boy, had something more to do with it.
My review of this matter included reviewing all original police reports.
The letter described the lengths that several agencies and investigators had gone to find the truth about how Josh died that night in his father's barn in San Martin, a small town 30 minutes down the freeway from San Jose. The letter said the DA's office had reviewed Josh's custody file, the restraining orders involving KW in Atoka, Oklahoma. It called medical examiner Michelle Jordan's review and reenactment of Josh's hanging very persuasive.
There has been no medical opinion to dispute the finding the cause of death was suicidal hanging. While I sympathize with your sorrow you must feel at the passing of Joshua Klaver, it is my decision that there is no sufficient evidence to file criminal charges in this matter.
So there it was, in black and white. Insufficient evidence to file criminal charges in Josh's death. Kathy had spent years praying for justice and badgering law enforcement. But in this formal letter, the case had come full circle, ending essentially where it began the day Josh died. Cause of death? Hanging. Manner of death? Suicide. The DA had pointed out discrepancies in what, quote, relevant witnesses told investigators compared to what Kathy had suggested they would reveal. Clearly that was a reference to KW's ex-wife, Bobby Klaver. Remember, she had become such a pivotal part of this story. Relevant witness number 1, it would seem. Bobby is the one who had come home that awful night to find KW in the house. The two of them went looking for Josh and came upon the horrific sight of him hanging in the barn. Remember the mysterious Facebook message that Kathy received 25 years after Josh's death? The one that suggested Bobby had confided in a friend that she long feared KW may have squeezed the life out of Josh and staged it as a suicide. When I went to Minnesota to ask Bobby, she wouldn't tell that to me.
I don't recall saying that.
Do you recall thinking it?
I don't recall. I'm sorry, I don't. I blocked a lot of things out after that night, and it took quite a few years.
And, as the DA's letter indicates, it appears she didn't tell it to the investigators either.
Memories and recollections can be affected by the passing of time and changes in circumstances. Regardless, there are no actual witnesses that can attribute Joshua's death to an intentional act by his father.
The news was devastating enough for Kathy, but the penultimate paragraph of the letter forced her to confront what no parent who ever fought desperately for a child could bear to read: that she was equally to blame.
Finally, the family court documents reveal that there were significant emotional issues occurring with Joshua Klaver near the time of his death. The testimony of two doctors at the December 17, 1987 hearing was that Josh was close to being psychotic due to the ongoing conflict between the parents. This extremely unfortunate reality corroborates the autopsy findings.
Close to psychotic due to the ongoing conflict between the parents? There were those words again, from Judge Jeremy Fogel's fateful ruling in 1987, when he restored partial custody to KW, just over a year before Josh died. But wait, Judge Fogel told me all these years later he had come to that conclusion without being informed about KW's abuse of Josh. When Kathy read those words, she broke down on the master bed and sobbed.
The DA, I feel, basically labeled me a cause of Josh's death because I had conflict with KW. And to see that in writing after all these years of fighting for him. Yeah, I had conflict with him. I had conflict with him kicking Josh, slapping him. It's written as if the conflict I have would have caused Josh a better life if I would have kept my mouth shut.
So what is a mother supposed to do? Not fight for custody when she finds out her son is being abused? I asked Kathy's lawyer from back then, Connie Jimenez.
I don't see that she had any choice.
But her answer was more complicated than that.
There's no question in my mind that the abuse played a part in whatever was happening in Joshua. That abuse was so damaging to his spirit and his little soul. However, the conflict of the family was a huge element, because having the parents critical of each other and having the parents disagreeing and having to go through all the legal proceedings and the cost of it all and the cost of the therapy. All of that has a tremendous impact on the child.
So here we were, nearly 3 decades later, and Kathy was more defeated than ever.
I understand this is not the news you wish to receive in this matter, and again, I am very sorry for your loss and continuing to stress. There is simply no evidence to support a filing of murder charges. Please consider the matter officially closed at this time. Sincerely, Stacy Capps.
The DA's letter made no mention of Judge Stewart's harsh commentary about the abuse that led him to take custody away from KW when Josh was 7. and it failed to acknowledge what seemed like such a momentous finding in 2014 by the county coroner and the child death review team, that abuse was a factor in Josh's suicide. Instead, it had reduced both of those conclusions to a brief mention of possible earlier acts of child abuse. That threw me, but the district attorney's office has refused my interview requests about Joshua's case and only issued statements. With what I know now, though, well, I better understood Kathy's frustration. The letter in her hands quoted, "An autopsy conducted without a rope," a reenactment from the medical examiner who didn't have enough information to know whether Josh was fully or partially suspended or had tied a knot, and a ruling from a judge who later told me he hadn't been informed that Josh had been abused by his father.
They want to put it in that piece of paper that he was dead because of the conflict that I had with the abuse. He's dead because the courts didn't do their damn job. He's dead because Judy and Bobby kept their mouths shut and watched KW abuse Josh and didn't say a damn thing. That's why he's dead.
For the record, Bobby, KW's second wife, told me she never witnessed KW abuse Josh, and Judy, KW's first wife, ultimately spoke up at the custody hearing before Judge Stewart. But as emotionally wrought, as angry as Kathy is at others, she told me she also remains, to this day, overwhelmed by her own guilt for descending into drug abuse when Josh was a toddler and sending her little boy to live with his father in the first place.
I made a choice to step down in the gutter with the drugs and alcohol. I made a choice. I wasn't drugged down there. I carry that. I'm responsible for everything that happened to Josh because I placed him on that path. Everything that happened to him after I placed him there, I'm responsible for. His mother.
As I found out over months of reporting on this story, she's not the only one who carries the burden of Josh's death. A number of people have shouldered parts of this tragedy for decades, like Judy Werner, KW's first wife, who took care of Josh for years and considered him one of her own sons. But she quit demanding to see him after problems arose with KW and his second wife, Bobby.
I know there were times when I thought, why did I not push harder rather than just back off and stay away? To be there, because I just felt like he must have been so sad. I guess sad would be the word.
Her words made me think of what Dr. Jordan had told me. She was the coroner trying to solve a mystery a quarter century later with so many of the pieces missing. "I'm doing the best I can," she said. But through Josh's story, I'd come to realize doing the best we can isn't always good enough. Just as I was putting the finishing touches on this podcast, I reached out one last time to the sheriff and district attorney to ask again if they would fill in the blanks about the years of investigations. It turns out the one who finally opened up was Under Sheriff John Hirakawa, who recently retired. Fill in the blanks? He filled up my recorder for more than an hour. But it soon became clear I was telling him as much as he was telling me. Hirakawa's the one who told Kathy and Dennis Atkins that the Klaver's divorce could provide a break in the case. He was a patrol deputy back when Josh died, just like KW. But in 2014, he was second in command and helped oversee the latest investigation before he retired last year. And like the judge and the coroner, he didn't know about Judge Stewart's ruling either.
If it was brought to my attention that one of our deputies had been accused in family court, brought to my attention, but has been accused of a crime, then it needed to be investigated.
And he didn't know that the rope never made it to the coroner. Do you think the sheriff's office did miss something in this case?
In regards to the suicide?
Yes.
It goes back to the rope. If we can take the rope, I'm going to say that was a big error. Now, whether Josh Klaver committed suicide, that would now, I would think that was going to be a hard, based on what I know, it's going to be very hard to say that K.W. Klaver hung Joshua Klaver, based on what was gathered and what was known.
One of his biggest concerns when he looked back on the case was how the sheriff's office handled the child abuse accusations at Josh's school years before the boy's death. He said after a child protective services worker sent Josh home with his mother, one of KW's fellow deputies showed up on another day and sent the boy home with KW. This may have been the story Kathy shared in Chapter 1 about arriving to pick up Josh after school and watching him ride away with KW, wearing his backpack, crying out for Mom.
That deputy should have known, hey, there's a potential conflict here, or I have a conflict here, and I need to step back. See, P.S., I made a recommendation. So why are you reversing that recommendation? It's all not good. It's not good. And that was a point for me that I had a heartbreak.
Do you think Josh hung himself?
I don't know. Again, I'll go back to my original statement. Hard to imagine a child that young hanging himself. But I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not I just don't know. I don't know. I have questions. I just don't know.
Hirakawa is running for sheriff next year to unseat his old boss, Lori Smith. For months I tried to interview her about this case, but each time her office would only provide an emailed statement calling Josh's death a tragedy beyond tragedies. Then, suddenly she took my call, days after we started publishing the first chapters in this podcast. Smith rose in rank in the 90s before being elected California's first female sheriff in 1998. She had tangled with KW in the years before he left on disability, as he bumped heads with the sheriff's office over unwanted job transfers and other issues.
And, if you ask me, Klaver was a problem employee.
Tell me about that.
I'm not sure I can. It's a problem, right?
She said she couldn't discuss personnel matters, but she had plenty of opinions about the former deputy.
He just seemed to be a problem all the time. Kind of like, I don't want to say scammer because that's not the right word. Deceptive's not the right word. Devious, maybe devious. He's always seemed devious.
How so?
And you can see I'm tap dancing here. He was always suspect for something. I don't mean a suspect, but there was always a sense that there was something wrong.
Wow. Well, that was sure interesting. But frankly, the sheriff was fuzzy about many of the details of how her office had handled the multiple investigations into Josh's death. She was a sergeant back when Josh died, but like Hirakawa, she was aghast at how KW's fellow deputies handled the child abuse complaints against him, especially the one at Josh's school.
To me, if I were to look at that today, I would say it was an attempt to cover it up.
Josh's mother continues to insist that the sheriff's office, and particularly Lori Smith, are still covering up something about her son's death. After digging into the story for months, I wasn't sensing a cover-up today, but more of an institutional failure from the top down that persisted for years, from the time KW's fellow deputies came to his side to protect him from child abuse accusations, to the quick conclusion that Josh committed suicide. I wanted to know, did the sheriff think her office had done everything to get to the bottom of Josh's death? And really, I had a bigger question. Did Sheriff Lori Smith think K.W. Klaver killed his son?
Oh, boy, that is really a tough question. I'm always a suspicious person. I never rule out anything, and I just don't have a solid opinion on that. I think that there's something more here. I just don't know what.
Why do you feel there's something more here?
You ask me just for what my sense is. And I just think that there were so many mistakes that were made, things that were done wrong. And when it comes to children, I'm so protective of victims and kids. And that's why this is particularly tragic. And that's why no matter what continues to happen, we'll continue to look at it. I don't know. The case bothers me. It bothers me a lot.
There have been so many twists in Josh's story, I shouldn't have been surprised when this happened. Just after we launched the first couple of chapters of this podcast, I received an intriguing voicemail.
Hello, Miss Sulek. My name is Shireen Archambault, and I have some information, and I don't know why no one has ever interviewed myself or my ex-husband. But we were the first ones on the scene the night that Josh hung himself. In fact, my ex-husband helped KW cut him down.
Seriously? Could that be? Someone else was in the barn that night, helping KW in the frantic minutes before the emergency workers arrived? Bobby had never mentioned that. Neither had any of the authorities connected to the case. What could this mean? Shireen Archambault and her now ex-husband Chuck used to live across the street from the Clavers. They've since moved to California's Central Valley. I quickly called back. So, yeah, I'm so glad you reached out to me. Tell me what you know. And
we heard screaming, and maybe that was when I got up and opened the window because it looked like somebody was out in the middle of the street waving their arms. And I'm like, what the heck? And so I got up and I opened the window, and we could hear Bobby screaming. Just like screaming. And she's jumping up and down. She's waving her arms. And my ex-husband, he just took off running for the barn.
We just went in, and KW was trying to cut him down, cut the rope. And I helped him as best I could, because I'm just a little short guy anyway, and I couldn't hardly reach to do much. I tried to take some of the boys' weight off the rope.
How high was Josh?
He's hanging from the rafters.
Bobby said that KW cut him down. She never mentioned that you were in the barn. I'm sure it was a chaotic night, but
yeah,
I think
my memory's pretty good.
But you're confident that he was not in that slaughter room?
Yeah, he wasn't in there, no.
Josh was hanging from a truss high up in the main part of the barn? Somebody else had told me something similar months ago when I first began my reporting. Sergeant Jerry Eggy, the homicide detective. He's the officer who had gone out to the barn a few days after Josh's death and talked to KW. But I had discounted this discrepancy because the coroner was clearly focused on the meat rail in KW's slaughter room. That's where Bobby Klaver told me Josh was hanging too. But after getting this call from a witness who apparently nobody had ever talked to, I reviewed my interview with Sergeant Eggy.
Well, it was in the barn. I remember there was it was like either steel or big beam that went across the barn. It was a truss going across the barn. And there was a way that you could climb up to it. And then they went out and they found him. He was hanging from that truss.
I've actually been in the barn, and I'm trying to... So it was like a rafter high?
A rafter, yeah, very high. It was pretty high. It was a big barn.
So it wasn't like in another smaller room, like with a...
No, I remember it was in the regular barn part.
I called back Chuck. I texted Bobby. Chuck says he's confident about what he saw, but he also points out he had a stroke in recent years. Bobby is certain. So I called Sergeant Eggy back too, and this time he acknowledged he really wasn't sure, that he might have assumed Josh was high up on a truss. He said he was really there to pay his respects that day, not to investigate. KW had simply pointed vaguely to where Josh was hanging, Eggy said. The reason I'm sharing this with you now is that it goes to show how, like the homicide experts had told me, it's impossible to go back and recreate the scene of a death. Impossible to get a clear story 28 years later from a witness. Even one who was a trained homicide detective. Even two neighbors who were there that night, especially when they could have been questioned on the spot, but weren't. So KW actually introduced you to the officers and they didn't ask you any questions?
They didn't ask me nothing.
What do you think about that?
It's a little odd, but I figured I would get all the questions. I'm getting them now from you.
One more thing about Shireen and Chuck Archambault. They can't begin to fathom that KW had anything to do with Josh's death. KW was a good neighbor, they said, and they saw the look on his face that night.
The stories about KW abusing him, or we never saw any of that, and I can't say whether it happened or not, but it's just like it's a huge jump to go from that to killing your child. And I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't think KW did it. And my ex-husband doesn't believe it either. And none of the neighbors that have been in contact with me since the podcast started believe it.
Today, many of the players in this case, the parents and step-parents, the lawyers and judges, the social workers and deputies, the ones who should have protected Josh, are still contemplating their roles in the brief life and heartbreaking death of a boy who was once happy, but ultimately never wanted to go home.
It's just one of those things that stays with you because it had such a tragic outcome.
That's Judge Jeremy Fogel, who went on to become a renowned federal judge, handing down major rulings on everything from technology law to lethal injection. Even before I called him this spring, Judge Fogel always wondered whether his ruling that granted KW partial custody in the end led in some way to Josh's death. Learning 28 years later that KW had a history of abuse that the judge somehow wasn't made aware of made it only worse.
I've done all these cases that got a lot of publicity and high profile and, kind of in the broader social context, maybe made more of a difference to more people. But I think if I were sort of cataloging, the 20 hardest cases I had in 30 years as a trial judge, this would be on the list. When you have cases where you have that kind of really traumatic and dramatic, both of those aspects, you don't forget them.
The tragedy still weighs on both lawyers in the custody case as well. Jimenez for Josh's mother and David Sussman for Josh's father. Looking back to the emergency hearing in Fogel's courtroom, Jimenez told me she doesn't remember exactly what she said or didn't say about KW's abuse.
That is where I'm really at a loss for trying to answer.
But she sees now it wasn't enough. She does remember, though, after Josh's death, the powerful feelings of grief that followed her every morning as she left her home. She lived near the Klavers, and as she drove down Church Avenue towards Columbet Avenue every day, the dormer on the Klavers hayloft, painted bright yellow back then, would always draw her attention.
Every time I would drive by it, I would just be gripped by the tragedy of the loss of Joshua. And again, as I'd mentioned before, by my sense of really despair at that time after he died, that we were unable to find some resolution so that he could receive the education, the treatment, and the home life, the family life that he needed.
She felt so bad about it, so overwhelmed, that she considered quitting her practice in family law. It seems so strangely ironic that Jimenez lived so close to the barn, that this hayloft for her became a beacon of despair. As I told you earlier, the deputies who came to the barn that night of Joshua's death, and even the sheriff at the time, also lived in the South County near KW. And I found a number of strange coincidences during my reporting that connected so many of us to Josh's story. Social worker Priscilla Merrick, who never believed Josh killed himself, lives just 2 blocks from me in San Jose. And David Sussman, who was KW's lawyer during the custody case all those years ago, he lives across the street from me. We've made a point to only discuss the case during formal interviews, when I've had a notebook in hand or the tape recorder on. Here's another twist, if you can believe it. The previous owner of Sussman's house? Judge Fogel, who was living there when he was new to the bench in 1987 and made the final ruling on the Klaver case. Sussman said he never felt he was on the wrong side when he was representing KW. He told me he was numb when he heard Josh died. The experience had a profound effect on him, especially in his professional relationship with Connie Jimenez, who ended up sticking with family law and eventually becoming a court commissioner.
There is that shared experience that is unlike anything else I've ever had with any other lawyer, or certainly anybody else on the bench. And I once asked her about it, and I said, every time I look at you, it's always the same. My first impression is always the same. Do you feel the same way? She said, yes. It was more, there was a level of intimacy, because we were both there. We were outside of it, but we were participants, okay? There was more intimate than relationships I've had. I mean, I wasn't friends with her. I don't think we ever had lunch. I only saw each other in court. But there was always that small part of each of us that we knew she had to trust me, and I had to be completely straight with her. Because that mattered. That little moment mattered. It made up a piece of who we were.
One of the most interesting voices to emerge since this podcast began airing was KW's younger daughter, Crystal Klaver. She's a school teacher in Oklahoma and came to her dad's defense in the commenting section of the Mercury News website. I tried to reach her by phone but couldn't. In the comments, she said she was a rebellious teenager when she filed for a restraining order against her father, and she regrets it. She called her dad a kind and loving man and insisted he never laid a hand on her. For KW, the district attorney's decision is vindication once again, after 3 investigations and nearly 3 decades of living under suspicion that may have ultimately dogged his career and darkened his marriage. I didn't expect it to change any, he told me in a recent phone interview. Suicide, he said, is all it ever was. He is steadfast that he was a good father who loved his son. I lost a child due to circumstances that were beyond my control, he told me. I did everything I could for him. When I met KW outside the Atoka auction barn in Oklahoma last summer, I asked him if, looking back, he would have done anything differently as a father. He said no at first, but when I asked him again if he had anything else he wanted to say, he paused for a moment. The only thing I can say, he said, is because Kathy and I battled so hard over the custody, that may have been a contributing factor that both of us should have looked at strongly at the time. Bobby Klaver, the stepmother who was a few steps behind KW when they found Josh hanging, is still haunted by the images in the barn that night. Now, all these years later, Bobby, who could only answer, "I don't know," when I asked whether she thought her ex-husband was capable of murder, insists it's time to move on. The custody battle was devastating for everyone, she said, especially Josh. How couldn't it be for any child torn between parents?
The therapist said the one thing he should never be forced to do was choose. Ever. Because the therapist said that he loved both of his parents. And if he chose one parent would be upset. If he chose the other, another parent would be upset. That he should never be forced to choose.
Yet here he was in the middle of this tug of war.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like as a step-parent to see What, Josh? What did you?
Heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. No one was the perfect parent back then. No one is ever a perfect parent. And Josh paid the ultimate price for this. But Josh is in a better place. And we have to be at peace now.
When I set out to tell this story, my editor, Mike Frankel, came across a headline from a newspaper. He cut it out and left it on my desk. I taped it to the top of my computer. "Your mission," it read, "solve the unsolvable." I had crisscrossed the country and found dozens of people whose stories I had hoped would help me explain the mystery behind this 10-year-old boy's death. But along the way, I would discover another mystery that was equally tragic. How could so many people have failed to protect Josh? Josh called 3 women mommy, but not one could be everything he truly needed in a mother. He loved a father whose raw power relationship, in Judge Stewart's words, left Josh bruised and beaten. Each of his parents had lawyers representing their interests in the courtroom, but despite his mother's attempts, Josh never had one looking after his own. In the end, maybe I had failed Josh too. I had learned as much as any outsider about Josh's short, tragic life, and more than perhaps anyone else about his father's unsavory behavior. But I still don't know exactly what happened to the boy in the barn on Columbet Avenue. I do know this, though. Children aren't always as resilient as we think, and adults are not always there to protect them. There's not a shred of hard evidence that Josh was murdered. No surprise witness, no glaring or blaring signs of foul play, no bombshell confession. But I found so many questions about the initial investigation that there also isn't the evidence to conclude with certainty that Josh killed himself. There's only the explanation that suicide was possible, that Josh was capable, and that the boy was saddened. Gilbert Sandoval, Josh's stepbrother when Josh was a toddler, is still uncertain.
No one's ever really going to know. And it was a long time ago. It's just something you got to kind of just choke down and go, that's the way it is.
Murder, after all, is a crime that requires a mountain of evidence. Suicide, it turns out, is a tragedy that requires almost none. On a bright morning, with the scent of garlic in the air, I drove to St. Mary's Cemetery in Gilroy, where Josh is buried. It's a breezy, peaceful place, somewhere between his father's old house and barn in San Martin and his mother's former house in Hollister. Now, both parents live more than 1,000 miles away. Before Josh was buried, Kathy told me, she placed inside his casket a suede satchel with his favorite marbles, G.I. Joes, and Transformers. The Klavers, she told me, had already left animal hides inside. Josh's headstone rests beneath a great old oak tree, its limbs outstretched. 2 things drew me closer: a small portrait of Josh with a sweet smile embedded into the stone, and an inscription across the bottom. It read, "Forever Young." Kathy had it engraved, not so much because Josh died young, she said, but because of the Rod Stewart song that was so popular the year he died. It's an anthem for all parents, but for Kathy, it became a mother. He had to go, and annoyed that KW never answered his phone. She called every 10 minutes for more than an hour, she said. It kept ringing and ringing. It was around 7 p.m. She allowed herself to lie down on the bed. The TV was blaring as her 2 young daughters watched, but she heard nothing.
You know, you heard a mother feel her child die. I laid on the bed and the house got real quiet.
spiritually quiet. I could barely hear my girls, their voices. The TV was almost like a mute, like there was a fuzz over it. And I lay down in the bed, and I knew that something happened to Josh, and I felt his body on me. It was energy, and it had weight to it, and I knew it was him. And I don't know how long I laid there, and it was like the feeling of him just wrapped around me, and then it started feeling lighter, and I could feel, and the energy just, it was almost like I could see it. It was so peaceful. It's like I knew something happened to him, and because he was there, I knew he was dead. But those moments were so peaceful.
That sense of peace is the only part of her eternal nightmare that gives her an ounce of solace. Josh's friend next door used to think there was a ghost in the barn, but Kathy never believed it.
You know, people talk about when something violent happens to you and there's death, that the spirits that get stuck, you know, because they don't realize. And I never worried all these years of Josh's broken heart being stuck in that barn, because I felt him go.
She knew he went to heaven, she said. She felt the weight of him rise. Hanging is an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose. This podcast was hosted and reported by Julia Prodis Sulek, that's me. It was produced by my editor, Mike Frankel, and our sound engineer, Paul Baca. Videos and photography by Lipo Ching. Additional video production by Tor Haugen and Sarah Dussault. Our website is designed by Pi, and Mike Mayer designed the series for the newspaper. Bert Robinson is our managing editor, and Neil Chase is our executive editor. To make sure you hear every chapter, subscribe to Hanging wherever you get your podcasts. To see photos, videos, and documents, and to read the series and comment on this podcast, go to www.mercurynews.com/hanging. That's Mercury, like the planet, news.com/hanging. If you like what you heard, leave us a review on iTunes, and tell us if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this one. Thanks for listening.